As an American, you can hardly go one day without hearing about China, and this is only going to increase in the future. Welcome everyone, my name is Ryan, and you've made it to the Chinese Connection, a page dedicated to the ever-evolving relationship between the United States and China. And so in today's video, we're going to address 7 major stereotypes that Chinese people have of Americans. Let's get into it. And the first one is, why are all Americans so fat? And they're not wrong. My father battled this his entire life and died early because of it, and I battled it repeatedly as well. And there are many ways to define obesity, but today we're gonna go with the BMI, or the body mass index. And the truth is, America has an absolutely staggering amount of overweight and obese people. Roughly 200 million people are obese or overweight, or 73% of the population. Rates have actually gone up 3 to 4 times since the 1960s over the span of about 65 years. I was actually very surprised to see that China is rapidly approaching the rates that the US has since China's 改革开放, or economic reform, but is doing so over a shorter amount of time. Currently, according to the State Council of the PRC, the rate of obesity in overweight Chinese is about 50%, with projections indicating a rise to 65% by 2030. But we all know that looks are not always what they seem. And that's because Americans tend to carry fat subcutaneously, which can make us appear fatter overall, even while we're actually healthy or even athletic. Conversely, Chinese tend to carry fat viscerally, that is, in their core around their organs, which means that while many Chinese look thin and healthy, they can actually be very unhealthy or even obese. If this surprised you like it did me, let us know in the comments your experience and what your thoughts are. And the reason for the increase in obesity in both countries is actually fairly clear. Economic growth, increased disposable income, more sedentary jobs, and an increased reliance on eating fat, unhealthy, convenient food. I've actually heard Chinese friends say that the reason Americans are so fat is because US fast food and junk food is actually cheaper than making food at home. This is absolutely false, but it does bring us to our next stereotype. And that is, Americans have no food culture at all. And I get it, Chinese cuisine is absolutely astounding, with 5,000 years of history and literally hundreds of dishes. And compared to a typical American's dinner, ours can look pretty boring. But you have to remember that the United States is only 250 years old, and we're a country of immigrants. In other words, it's very heterogeneous, and you can actually find authentic dishes of every nation's food here. Pretty much anything you could want. But in China, being a much more homogenous nation, it's much more difficult to find authentic dishes from other countries. And yes, it's true. We do Americanize foods. Panda Express is probably the biggest culprit that comes to mind, but hear me out. Number 1, it's not considered actual Chinese food. Number 2, many of my Chinese friends absolutely love Panda Express. And number 3, every country makes its own style of food. But I've also seen what you guys do to pizza and Pizza Hut, and it's an absolute travesty to American taste buds. But that's okay, because in China it works. And finally, Panda Express has fortune cookies, which all Americans love, but we don't even know is not Chinese. And if you actually know the real history of how fortune cookies made it to America, let us know in the comments below. In fast food, of course we have fast food, and we love fast food, but we're not the only ones. China does have an increased love for this type of food as well. Everywhere I go in China, I see KFC, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Shake Shack, Subway, Starbucks, and more. However, in China, many of these places are kind of considered somewhat high-end and or very expensive, which brings me to my next stereotype. Americans are all rich and live in luxury. I mean, I get it. News, Instagram, Hollywood movies have all depicted America being this wonderful place that if you don't live in a mansion in Beverly Hills, you live in a 5-bedroom house and don't worry about money at all. And this is typically what people think when they think of America. I mean, I've spoken to many Uber drivers that are somewhat disenchanted with the concept of the American dream. They work here very hard hours and barely have enough to live, pay for their car, and send a little bit of money home every month. And this is the reality. The US is not rich everywhere. You can actually examine it with something called the Gini coefficient, which measures the income inequality of a nation, with a bigger coefficient indicating a bigger inequality, which is generally bad. And the US actually has a pretty extreme income inequality with a Gini coefficient of 41.3. Comparably, Mexico is actually higher at 43.5, and China is lower at 35.7. And the US certainly deals with poverty. In 2023, roughly 11% of the USA was below our poverty threshold, estimated to be around 138 million people. And one of the most pressing topics today for both China and America is home ownership. There's something called the home price to income ratio. And this basically shows how many years' salary it would take you to purchase a normal home. In the 1960s, it was roughly between 2 or 3, depending on where you live. Now, it's averaging about 5.8, making homeownership nearly impossible for many Americans. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts and your experience on this phenomenon. In short, things have changed drastically in the last 50 years. In 2024, on any given night, there could be 770,000 homeless throughout the nation. This is due to a number of factors: increased housing costs, inadequate minimum wage, lack of public assistance, and of course, mental health and substance abuse can play a large part in homelessness. And that brings us to our next stereotype. Drugs are legal in the United States. Movies about Mexican cartels, Breaking Bad, have made this topic something I hear about all the time. From my understanding, in China, alcohol and cigarettes are kind of not very bad, but everything else is very addictive, it's very dangerous, and therefore very illegal. And Americans actually view it very differently. We believe that alcohol and cigarettes are actually some of the most harmful, dangerous, and addictive drugs available today. And in general, they're consumed for the same reasons as other drugs. China has had an absolutely horrific history with drugs. In particular, when England basically made China addicted to opium in order to take advantage of trade, power, and control. So it makes sense to me that China would treat all drugs with the same level of contempt. Ironically, the US actually learned about opium through trade with England and through the Chinese laborers that came to the US to help with the gold rush and build railroads. And in general, major drugs like opiates, cocaine, amphetamines, and marijuana were legal and used openly for medical and health reasons in the US since the mid-1800s. Coca-Cola soda from 1886 to 1929 actually had significant amounts of cocaine in it, and of course, after time, people slowly began to realize how addictive and dangerous these drugs were. But a major change in America came in the 1970s, when the legislature created the Controlled Substances Act, which classified drugs based on their potential for abuse and medical use. And I think this is one of the major differences between the ideologies between the two nations. For instance, we know that consuming too much alcohol can lead to violence, drunk driving deaths, and liver disease. And none of these are associated with marijuana, which is why in 1996, California made laws that allowed it to be used medically for people suffering from diseases. And since that time, 24 out of 50 states have allowed certain use recreationally. Many Chinese friends think that you can do it openly on the street, which is not true. The negative views from outside the US tend to be associated with organized crime and related gun violence, which brings us to the next stereotype. America is super dangerous and full of guns. I would say it's true and false. There are very dangerous areas in the United States associated with violence and crime, but people don't always walk around with guns, nor does anyone I know walk around in constant fear of being shot. And this is in spite of the fact that the US really does have tons of guns. There's estimated to be between 400 and 500 million guns in the United States, which is almost 2 for every adult person. And that's more guns than the next 24 countries that allow people to own them. And of course, it's related to the history of the United States. The US actually had a war and won its independence from England. And when the US began to draft its constitution, it wanted to enable all citizens the ability to protect themselves. And of course, in the US, some states have different laws than other states. But in Washington state, for instance, I can actually carry a gun openly like a cowboy. But if I want to concealed carry one and hide it, I actually need a license. And of course, everyone asks, with all the murders, with all the school shootings, with all the crime, why doesn't America just ban guns? And I would answer your question with another question. If we know that driving can cause accidents and deaths, why don't we ban driving? Or if we know that cigarettes and alcohol also cause disease and death, why do we allow these? And it's simple. It's that people believe the overall benefits of these things outweigh the costs of these things. And this is true of any law that's ever been made in any country for the history of the world. This is a very polarizing topic, so if you have a strong feeling or idea, feel free to drop it in the comments below. And it's not that Americans are gun-loving, violent, crazed idiots that love shooting each other. And it's a right that many Americans feel privileged to have, which brings me to my next stereotype. Americans lack family and collective values. A lot of Chinese people still think Americans are wild, vigilante cowboys with no sense of morality. And while America is certainly different from China in a lot of ways, there are of course a lot of overlapping values. In terms of dating and marriage, yes, hookup culture exists. especially on college campuses, and it's usually associated with alcohol abuse. Many Americans still hold very traditional or religious views towards relationships, dating, and marriage. And in the US, marriage is really more about individual choice and less about family compatibility. There is certainly no intense mother-in-law, daughter-in-law dynamic that you find in China. And men are expected to protect and honor their new immediate family rather than to defer to their parents at all times. And in terms of independence, yeah, it's a big part of American culture. Teenagers often work while going to school to have extra money to spend, and many move out at 18 to be independent or to go to college. But it's not the fact that they're always kicked out at 18. I know many parents that welcome hardworking, respectful kids to stay at home. And now, multi-generational living is at a higher rate than any time since the Great Depression. And finally, it's true that US parents might seem more carefree and relaxed when it comes to raising their child, especially compared to the tiger moms, which are known to dictate education, hobbies, free time, and make all decisions for their kid. But in the US, rigorous study and achievement is expected, so is training for independence. Mental health and development is also very important here. Physical affection, hugs, and verbal affirmations of "I love you" are normal and daily occurrences, and that's because we believe they're extremely important for raising a healthy child. And as a whole, the United States is still a Christian nation. The world often forgets that this is where the concept of human equality and human rights actually comes from. And of course, the US believes in family, society, and recognizes that the collective good is very important, but also recognizes that innovation, creativity, and personal resilience is often fostered by being able to be independent in thoughts and actions. The US is certainly not perfect, and it often falls short of its own ideals, just like you and me. Which brings us to the next stereotype. Americans love war and love our military. So many Chinese comment on my videos, Chinese love peace, but Americans love war. And with roughly 750 military bases, $1 trillion defense budget, which is greater than the next 9 countries combined, I can understand how you might feel this way. But not all Americans love war, and in fact, many people oppose it. No one likes to think that their government does bad or horrific things. I mean, when I was a kid, I remember thinking America had a good military, and we were nice, and we helped the world all the time. And I had a German friend at college ask me how I felt that I was part of a nation that often invaded and bullied other nations. And historically, if our military acts in a defensive way, it acts in response to a clear threat, and has a very quick timeline, it tends to receive more support from the public. For instance, in World War II after Pearl Harbor, the invasion of Panama in 1989, Desert Storm, and the global war on terror after 9/11 were all perceived as generally favorable. However, when Americans' military actions are seen as offensive, with unclear goals, and no defined timeline, it tends to have public opinion mostly against it. Actions like Vietnam, the most recent Iraq War, and the delayed Afghanistan campaign have all been met with serious public backlash. As transparency and access to declassified documents has increased over time, Americans are more and more aware of what the US has done in the past, many actions of which are undemocratic or aimed more towards profit or control. And it's no secret that after World War I and World War II, the United States recognized that going to war can bring huge benefits for the economy. This has led to the infamous United States military-industrial complex, in which many private firms are basically their own economy and benefit greatly whenever the United States is involved in a conflict. And that's because governments are just made up of people. And although we often try to do the right things, we often fall short of these ideals. And Americans are very aware and very critical of this, and is probably one of the most important topics in our lives. 美国人并不都爱战争，他们和中国人一样，想要和平. That is, Americans don't all love war and want peace just like Chinese. And we have way more in common than we do different. And in next week's video, we're going to explain 7 stereotypes that Americans have of Chinese. And if that topic sounds interesting to you, or you got some value from today's video, I'd ask that you'd click the subscribe button and join our community to stay up to date with future related videos. And if you're interested in topics like these, you're definitely going to want to check out the 2 videos here, where we talk about 7 freedoms that you can do in China that you cannot do in the United States, as well as 7 things that you can't do in China that will definitely surprise you as an American. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.